theanswer.com.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I love the story of late bloomers as opposed to the wonderkind, the 25-year-old
Millennials.
overnight success who knows everything but doesn't. So one of my favorites, I think I mentioned this the other day when we talked about this piece in the Wall Street Journal by Rich Karlgaard from Forbes about Colonel Sanders. I love this one. Sold fried chicken, like starting in the Depression, from a roadside restaurant in Kentucky. His original restaurant closes in 1952. He's 62 years old. That's when he pursued franchising his chicken and what ultimately became known today as KFC, or Representative Stephen Cohen's favorite meal. So...
That Stephen Cohen guy looks creepy.
Finger looking good, though.
Ew, gross.
62. Late bloomers.
62. That's amazing.
This is the subject of, and I mean, of course, you saw the movie or you've read about Ray Kroc at McDonald's, right?
Yep.
So the founder, great movie. Michael Keaton was
Arlington
excellent.
Heights.
So this is an interesting book and sort of the science in some part, methodology, approach to life, sort of all combined into one. This book, Late Bloomers, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement, by Forbes publisher, also speaker, best-selling author, Rich Karlgaard, who joins us now. Rich, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning, Dan and Amy.
And I guess you wrote this book about late bloomers because, as you say, you are one.
Well, sure. I'm a late bloomer at age 25. Despite a college degree, I could still hold a job of no greater responsibility than dishwasher, security guard, temp typist. And I remember one night doing my security guard rounds at a rent-a-truck firm. I heard a dog barking, and I swung my flashlight and saw that my counterpart in the other yard was a Rottweiler, and it occurred to me that my professional peer at age 25 was a dog. And, a few months later, Steve Jobs, also 25, would take Apple public. And so I
make you
always
feel
wondered
bad
if
about
there's an
yourself.
opportunity to share this story. And I think now is the time, because those inspiring stories you just mentioned about Colonel Sanders and Ray Kroc, it's kind of a sad thing when you Google late bloomers, you still get those stories. They're inspiring stories, but they're old stories. Why are we not celebrating the current late bloomers, and why do we so over-celebrate these young achievers to the point of driving kids and families insane? And that's why I decided to plunge in and write this book.
Well, one of the more current stories that you memorialized in your piece in the Wall Street Journal is Ken Fisher, who runs Fisher Investments. It's got $100 billion under management, pretty big, 50,000 customers, pretty big operation. But Ken Fisher wasn't an overnight success in his 20s either.
No, Ken flunked out of junior college. Now, I submit that it takes some creativity to flunk out of junior college. but he was distracted, easily distracted. He followed his father into personal finance. Ken hung out his own shingle, but he couldn't get any clients. The few he had left him. His own office assistant left him, and he had to supplement his income with construction jobs and playing slide guitar in a bar. And it wasn't until, but he was reading magazines. He was reading trade magazines all along and reading books on investment. And even when it didn't appear that he was blooming, his brain was working on an idea. And as he likes to say, I came up with an unconventional way of valuing companies. And then suddenly in his 30s, at around 35, he really began to bloom. And today he's, $100 billion under management.
Well, let's talk about recent research, that you wrote about, that how people mature from adolescence to adulthood. It has to do with our brain.
Yeah, the prefrontal cortex of our brain isn't fully developed until our mid to late 20s, and that's really that's where we get what we call adult executive function. And so we can be brilliant prodigies still lacking that adult function. Hell, just look at some of those Silicon Valley young CEOs when you get them in front of Congress. So for some people it's later. I'm convinced that for myself it was later. For Ken Fisher it was later. But we put such extraordinary pressure on kids to do well in school, to do well in standardized tests, that if they don't hit that window early, they leave school thinking they're somehow second-rate citizens. And I think that's just a tragic loss, that we've got to make room for slower developing people. There are ways to do that. I'm a big believer in gap years after high school, before starting college. I'm a huge believer, particularly in this economy today, that we should have never given up on the skilled trade jobs track. In high school, only 1 out of 20 public high schools offers it. And you look at all the great jobs out there in welding and carpentry and construction and electricians kinds of jobs that pay well, produce in economic terms a rapid return on investment because you don't have to go to school long time to do it, and you can always decide to go to college later. Who wouldn't want the kid who was a welder till age 26 and then decided to go back to college and be a civil engineer? I mean, that would be the perfect employee for a lot of companies.
Yeah, and one of the things that you point out, too, about the science, going back to that for a second, is about how people's essentially emotional intelligence, emotional IQ, ability to do a better job of assessing people really doesn't mature into their 40s, until they're in their 40s. And I mean, and that's sort of uniquely a attribute of the good executive, the good manager of people.
Yeah. The recent research is so life-affirming that I wish we would just embrace this notion that is scientifically now proven. In 2015, Harvard, MIT, and Massachusetts General Hospital did this study asking a simple question: at what age do our cognitive abilities peak? And it's a very complex and intriguing answer. We peak in different ways at different decades of our lives. So sure enough, the kind of attributes like rapid synaptic processing speed and working memory, the things that might make you a great software programmer, peak in our teens and 20s. And as you mentioned, all of those cognitive skills that support executive functioning, leadership, communication, compassion, they only really begin to develop our 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then amazingly, in our 60s and 70s, we acquire these neurological attributes that support this notion of wisdom. The brain makes way for us to be wise as we get older.
No.
Now, I wanted to get some advice and counsel, because I'm thinking about becoming a late bloomer, like getting out of this
right.
dead end job where I can, look.
You have your own radio show.
Look across. Like
He's
They
self-deprecation.
give these to everybody today. Here's the thing. One of the success stories, the late blooming stories that you reference, I really like. It's much like Samuel Jackson, Alan Rickman, Hans Gruber from Die Hard.
Yeah.
He was like an entrepreneur until his early 40s, if I'm remembering correctly, and then he got I don't know how he did it, but he got the gig at Die Hard, and he became this great movie villain. I want to become a great movie villain and get out of talk radio. Well, how do I do it?
First of all, believe in yourself, right?
Well, one of the things that intrigued me about this book, I spent 4 years doing the research. There was no clinical or official definition of what a late bloomer was. So I thought, this is virgin territory. Let me propose one. And blooming occurs when you land at the intersection of your native gifts, your deepest passions, and your driving purpose. If you can be at that intersection, then you're going to bloom. So maneuvering your way, if you really feel like you haven't been well used, I didn't write this as I wrote this as a secular book because I wanted to reach believers and non-believers both. But I'm a believer, and I believe that if we're created in God's image, then we have great destinies. And blooming is really finding that supreme destiny. And you find it at the intersection of native gifts, deepest passions, and purpose.
The other thing about that, too, in terms of some of the perspective on that in the book, self-doubt. Self-doubt is a good thing.
It's a good thing if used properly. I think popular culture does a disservice when it asks us to sort of bull our way through self-doubt with this kind of fake confidence, fake it till you make it, etc. And sure, that can get us through a pinch. but as a long-term strategy, it isn't sustainable. It's more of a tactic than a strategy. The strategy is, how do we learn to look at our self-doubt, because we all have self-doubt whether we're accomplished or not, in a way that's useful for us, because self-doubt usually contains some good information. We're not prepared. We need to add somebody else to our team. We need a new set of friends and colleagues, whatever it is. And this gets back to this idea that if we're divine creatures created by a divine being, then we have inherent self-worth. So task number one is to never let our self-doubt infect our sense of self-worth. That's a really losing proposition. Wall that off, then step back and look clinically at the self-doubt and say, I really don't like that you showed up right now, but what information are you delivering to me right now?
So let's go back to when you were 25 years old and you were a security guard and your coworker was a Rottweiler. What did you do to reinvent yourself, and how long did it take?
Well, most of my security jobs were not at trucking yards. I was actually the guy who came in and replaced the receptionist at 5 o'clock and worked until midnight in an office building. And that gave me a lot of time to read. And I began to discover political opinion journals across the ideological spectrum. I started reading leftover New York Times and Wall Street Journal copies. I read everything that I liked. I read Humboldt's Gift by Chicago's own Saul Bellow. And that was really the first work of literature that I'd ever read and loved. I read it multiple times. So one day when I was 26 and I was a temp typist at the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto, some of the guys that I was running with at noon said, why are you still stuck in the temp typing pool? And I said, well, I don't really want to be. And they gave me an opportunity to be a technical writer. And I leaned into that. And a whole side of my brain, the side that I never even knew was there, the side of logical thinking, working alongside of engineers, opened that side up. And I literally felt, it was almost like the beginning of a new day. I was a new person at that point.
Very interesting. So let me ask you this, since the book is about late bloomers and sharing your story in part, was George Bernard Shaw right that youth is wasted on the young?
Yeah, and now we're putting so much money into that idea. I mean, look at the amount of money that parents, and we're talking, middle class and upper middle class and affluent families, but look at the kind of money that they're spending on college prep courses, tutoring classes, private schools of all kinds.
Bribes.
All with the objective of getting their kid into the quote-unquote most elite university they can, on this belief that that the only way they're going to thrive in the future in a world driven by high finance and high tech is to have those credentials. And so it's wasted on, this obsession it's wasting human capital. Imagine if you're natively gifted carpenter going to school today, but you've never been exposed to carpentry because nobody in your family is in it. And all you know, though, is that you're the kid who can't pay attention in school. You don't do well on standardized tests, and then so you're labeled a slacker simply because your native gifts and passions and purpose weren't revealed. So we're so lopsided. The emphasis on the SAT and grades, I get why it happened. I write about it in the book. It was a weapon of meritocracy aimed at the lazy aristocracy. But it's run amok. It's so overshot today, and that's why I believe we need a corrective.
He is Rich Karlgaard. He's the publisher of Forbes magazine. He's a columnist, speaker, best-selling author. His new book, you got to check it out. If you've read, and particularly if you've read the Wall Street Journal piece, you'll know why. The book is Late Bloomers: The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. Rich, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan and Amy.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560.